HBO's The Last of Us came out 2 years ago, which is honestly insane to even think about. Like the general audiences and critics, I loved the show and I thought it was an excellent retelling of the iconic Naughty Dog story from the Last of Us game released in 2013. It added a few things that weren't in the game that I thought was honestly excellent, and it left a few things out that I definitely disagreed with, but overall, I thought it was by far the best video game adaptation we'd seen at the time. Now, context for this video, I am a massive Last of Us fan. I love this world, I love these characters, and The Last of Us Part 1 is basically on par with Red Dead 2 as my favorite game of all time. I know, real original take. And I even named my cat Ellie. This is just one of my favorite video game stories ever told, so if I do have a bias toward the game over the show that comes out in this video, you can probably start to see where I'm coming from. Now, with the Season 2 marketing starting to ramp up and the 2-year anniversary of the show's release, I felt like it was time to revisit HBO's The Last of Us, to take a retrospective look into the show. Was it really as good as we thought, or were we just consumed by hype at the time? How has it aged, as I have seen the internet slowly turn on this show in the past year specifically? Why is that? So I decided to rewatch it for this video, and I was surprised by how I felt. The things I loved upon revisiting, the things I didn't like. There is a lot to get to in this video, and it's going to be a big one. This is HBO's The Last of Us 2 years later. Now, I think it's fair to say that the show started extremely strong. It generally just nailed the tone and aesthetic of the world straight off the bat, but it did a great job in bringing to life all of these iconic characters as well. It was clear from the start that showrunner Craig Mazin, who was behind the incredible Chernobyl series, alongside Neil Druckmann, they understood the assignment of adapting the beloved game. Not to mention, bringing back and reusing Gustavo Santaolla's music was simply a non-negotiable if this show was going to work. You can't make The Last of Us without him. They really had all the key pillars in place from the get-go for this show, and it did translate. The cold opening where Jonathan from The Mummy explains why fungus scares the hell out of him not only serves as a great scene just in general, but it sets this world up. It essentially tells you exactly what you're about to see and why it's so terrifying. It sets the tone and the inevitable direness our characters are about to face. Not to mention the things he's talking about are very real, which should scare you even more. This cold opening is not in the game whatsoever. The game picks up with Sarah and Joel on the couch, but we don't get to that point until about the 15-minute mark of the first episode. Everything prior to that is a more than welcome addition. Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann did say with this show that they weren't going to change or add anything unless it made it better, and I think the first episode especially shows us that they were pretty well true to their word. But the only real change this show made evident in the first episode that I feel was a step back from the game was the fact that spores aren't in the show. Now, spores were an integral part of the game. If you breathe them in, you get infected. Ellie is the only person who can walk through them without it infecting her because of her immunity. Now, they chose to keep spores out of the show because they thought it would be harder to buy the idea that spores localize in certain areas like they do in the games. This explanation was originally enough for me the first time I watched the show, but just a few days ago we got another teaser trailer for Season 2 where we got our first look at this scene specifically. Now, for those who don't know, super mild spoilers for The Last of Us Part 2 here, but Ellie chases someone into a spore-infected area, and the fact Ellie is unaffected by the spores leads said person to figuring out who she is. It's one of a couple great moments in the second game, specifically revolving around spores, that simply can't exist now because of this omission in the show. And having seen a quick glimpse of that scene from the Season 2 trailer has retroactively made me fairly disappointed in the fact that spores were omitted from this show in this season, and upon rewatch, it did bother me a little bit. But spores aside, this show did a great job in setting up this world and characters. It made a conscious effort to spend more time with Sarah specifically, and I think this was a good decision. Not only do we spend more time with Sarah, but we get to see the beginning of the outbreak. There's a lot of subtleties that upon rewatch you can actually appreciate. Whether it's the fact that they didn't have pancakes, or the fact that Joel forgot the birthday cake that night, or the fact that Sarah never ate the cookies from the neighbors. All of these were very deliberate details which gain context when Joel explains to Ellie how the infection started to spread in episode 3. For that reason, I would say that this is actually one of the more rewatchable pilots for a TV show I've seen. There are a lot of little details here and there that you will pick up on. I think the pilot of The Last of Us made it clear that this was going to be a great adaptation that just understands what made The Last of Us such an iconic game in the first place. The fact the entire outbreak sequence was shot handheld goes a long way in selling the chaos the characters are going through. The shots looking out the front of the truck on the highway are literally ripped straight from the game. Like, they just understood the assignment here. I appreciated it when the show came out, but I appreciate it even more upon rewatch. And the way they handled Sarah's death was crucial. The entire basis of this show rests on her death. You need to be able to buy the father-daughter bond between Joel and Sarah, and they don't have a lot of time to establish it. We need to see what was taken away from him, which leads him to becoming the man he is when we catch up with him 20 years later. So Sarah's death, they made the right decision, and they didn't change anything from the game. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, and this scene was one-to-one as a result, and it works so well. But then we of course jump 20 years into the future. We see how broken Joel is, and the story gets rolling. Now, Anna Torv as Tess was honestly pretty good casting. She doesn't really look like Tess from the game, but she embodied the character extremely well. But speaking of casting, let's talk about Ellie. Because regardless of what you talk about with this show, the conversation always, without fail, comes back to Bella Ramsey as Ellie. Look, I think Bella Ramsey did a good job in portraying the snarky and rigid side of Ellie, and for the most part played the vulnerable side of her too. And I think she's serviceable as Ellie in this season specifically and gets the job done. But I do think Ellie in this show is massively inferior to the game, and I'll touch on that more throughout the video. Honestly, I think Bella Ramsey cast as Ellie in season 1 works well enough, but going into season 2, that's where I have a lot of concerns. But we of course will get into that in more detail when season 2 actually comes out. Now, the scene where Joel and Ellie meet for the first time is very important, and I think it's pretty good. I still prefer it in the game, however. The scene conveys the fact that Ellie has to be escorted to the Fireflies, and it's of utmost importance. But we as the viewer know there's more to it. Because in the show, we get a scene of Ellie being tested beforehand, and a conversation with Marlene. Now, this was a big deviation from the game, and one that I'm honestly fine with. When they escape the QZ that night, we see the guard Joel trades with catching them trying to escape, and the situation immediately triggers Joel's PTSD from Sarah's death. He does what he never did the day he lost Sarah. These two scenes alone show you the difference between Joel at the beginning of the episode and the end. The scene also does a lot for Ellie too. This is the first time we see someone really protect her, and given revelations down the line about Ellie's greatest fears, this is an important scene for both Joel and Ellie going forward. We of course do have the reveal scene of Ellie's bite, and I think the game definitely does this better. It feels like they just took their time with it a little bit more, let the moment breathe a little bit, whereas the show kind of rushed through it. But despite Tess and Joel's skepticism, they're forced to embark on their journey regardless of the revelation, and that basically caps off the pilot. This is honestly, even upon rewatch, a great pilot from just about top to bottom. It's not perfect, but it's pretty damn close. It set the tone of the world, it established Joel's loss, it does a great job in getting us familiar with the fact that nobody is thriving in this apocalypse, and everyone is just surviving. It's a great start. Episode 2 essentially continued the momentum of the pilot. The tension and suspense in this episode is honestly incredible. And considering it was the first episode that Neil Druckmann directed, hats off to him. I know it's kind of the trendy topic to just hate Neil Druckmann, but credit where credit's due. For his first time in the director's chair for a show, he killed it in this episode. The cold opening in this show in Jakarta is just an extra addition the show made that wasn't in the game to flesh out the outbreak and how people dealt with it, when it began, and it's also a great callback to the radio in the pilot. Both cold openings are proof that you can still add to an already great story, and moments like these justify the show's existence. This episode also elaborated on one of the biggest changes this show made from its source material, the idea that the infected are a hive mind, with the tendrils in the mouth, and the networks underground that can alert a horde miles away. This was a fresh new idea, and I don't think it takes anything away from the game. But after this episode, this never really comes up again for the rest of the season, which is a little bit strange. It does add an extra interesting layer to the infected, don't get me wrong, but beyond this episode, we don't really see any of this happen again. I imagine season 2 is going to have quite a lot of it, but for it to come up in episode 2 and then not really come up again is a little bit strange. Now, the nods to the game are great in this episode and can go completely over your head. The roof caving in behind Joel, Tess, and Ellie in the museum is actually a pretty funny detail. This is something they do in games to free up memory, and I thought this was a smart little nod to that. There's also the moment of Tess going ahead to help open a door, which again is something we see a lot in the games too. Like, it's clear that Neil Druckmann directed this episode with those little nods to the game in place that only real hardcore gaming nerds probably even know. Now, the first time we see clickers is honestly a huge deal, and props to the makeup and sound department. The clickers are so well brought to life in this show. The suspense when Joel's reloading the gun as the clicker walks up to him is seriously effective, and it gives you that feeling that you had when you played the game. It also probably helps in the show's favor that the show made 2 clickers feel like 10 from the game, which is something I don't mind. There's also a really good scene in this episode where Joel and Tess debate Ellie's immunity. Joel is extremely cynical at this point. The world is over, there's no chance, no hope, it's just about survival at this point. But Tess acts as more of the optimist in the situation, saying that what if it is real? What if she's actually immune? Joel and Tess are interesting because Tess is a hardened survivor just as much as Joel, but she's still clinging onto her humanity where Joel has completely let it go. It kind of reminds me of Rick and Shane in The Walking Dead, especially in the earlier seasons. One was much quicker to let his humanity go in order to survive, and the other wasn't as much. And all of this comes to a head at the end of the episode after Tess is bitten. And this is my favorite scene of the episode because it tells us so much about Joel despite the fact he barely says a word. This is a scene that I actually prefer more in the show than I do in the game. No knock on the scene in the game or anything, I just think this version of it is slightly better. Joel and Tess's relationship, or lack thereof, is very much danced around, but Tess's dying wish is essentially to get Joel to see this through, stating that she never asked him to feel the way she felt, but to do this one thing, to take Ellie on the off chance this could mean something for humanity. The blink and you'll miss it line of "I never asked you to feel the way I felt" adds so much more context to Joel's self-enforced isolation. He never lets anyone too close, and even if they are close, he won't allow himself to love again. He won't allow himself to have a relationship after what happened to Sarah. It's a small line, but it says a lot and adds further weight down the road when Joel eventually lets those emotional barriers down around Ellie. Joel's silence before leaving Tess behind speaks 1,000 words, and I absolutely love it. This was just another great episode. Oh boy, here we go. I imagine a lot of people have skipped to this point of the video as this episode was probably the biggest talking point of the entire season. A lot of people hailed this episode as the best episode of the show, one of the best episodes of TV, period. Others had a more balanced approach with reasonable criticism, and some people, well, just were crying out for a therapist. Now, this episode took the Bill portion of the game and expanded it out into something new, offering us an insight into a rare happy ending in the apocalypse. People who managed to essentially beat the apocalypse, find something worth living for, and die old and satisfied on their own terms. Not only did the story of Bill and Frank serve as a brief bit of happiness in a sad and miserable world, but Bill and Frank's story adds a lot to Joel's character. Now, a lot of people say this is just a pointless filler episode that gets us nowhere and doesn't progress Joel or Ellie, which is just objectively not true, like even a little bit. The definition of filler episode is as follows. Filler episodes are entries in a generally continuous serial that are unrelated to the main plot, don't significantly alter the relations between the characters, and generally serve only to take up space. How anyone on this planet can think this is a filler episode concerns the living hell out of me, and it's basically just admitting that the entire plot of the episode went over your head or you just didn't watch it. Look, I get that this is subjective media and everything, but the amount of people using, and I quote, pointless filler as a means to diminish this episode, considering by very definition, it is just not a filler episode, is just insane to me. Like, if you don't like this episode, that's cool. It's subjective media at the end of the day, but don't make shit up to justify why you feel that way. In the last 4 to 5 years, people have overused the term filler to the point where I don't think people even know what it actually means anymore. And the filler claims came out not just in this episode, but episodes 4 and 7 as well. And you know what? I'm about to go all white dad in jeans and New Balance sneakers on you all, because newsflash buster, this show doesn't have filler episodes. Like, by definition, it objectively does not have them. Anyway, the first 15 minutes of this episode show us Joel and Ellie continuing their journey now without Tess. We see Joel on a creek stacking rocks for her, showing us that despite his cold facade, there is still that slither of something there for him. We then get more of Joel and Ellie's relationship. Joel's still closed off from Ellie, but she shows us that she's capable of standing up to his bullshit, which is something Ellie does in the game several times. We also learn that Joel has a bullet graze on his head that gets referenced to in the final episode. It's actually a really important seed they plant in episode 3 for one of the best moments of the show down the line. There's also a really great scene where Ellie finds an infected pinned down in a basement. She takes the knife out and cuts it open, clearly curious about the infected in general. Now, we know from the game that Ellie carries a lot of guilt over her immunity. It's one of the key traits of her character, which comes more to the forefront as the story progresses. But this is the first time we really start to get a glimpse into that idea. You could also read this scene as it leaning into Ellie's curiosity about the infected. When she cuts its face and it doesn't react, it's kind of the reassurance she needs that there's no trace of that person left. You could also read this scene as her not just being curious, but being frustrated by what happened with Riley, which is touched on later in the season. There's a ton of ways you can read this scene, and all of it adds a ton of depth to Ellie as a character. This episode also gives us more information on the origins of the infection, how it spread, that they believe cordyceps mutated and got into the food supply. It tells us why Joel, Sarah, and Tommy were very lucky that they didn't end up infected themselves, with the pancakes, the birthday cake, and the cookies referenced in the first episode. This is also the first time in the show where we see Joel and Ellie actually have a level conversation. We also get more world building. The plane wreckage. This scene reminds us that Ellie's never known life before the apocalypse, which adds to her character. It's endearing seeing her fascinated by something as simple as flying in a plane. And the world building continues, showing us how humans were handled after the outbreak by those in charge, how people were murdered in droves if the QZs overflowed. This show really does a lot with fleshing out the outbreak itself and immediate aftermath, and it makes the world feel just so much more rich as a result. But boy, it's a good thing this is just a filler episode, because that was just the first 14 minutes. Because we then get to the Bill portion of the episode, and hats off to Nick Offerman here. This was perfect casting, to be honest, and he's probably the most well-cast character in the show, I'd argue. I already touched on why the Bill and Frank portion of the episode was so good, so I'm not going to retread all of that ground here, but this is one of the best moments of the show. Just the acting, the directing, the writing, it's all top shelf. When Joel and Ellie arrive to Bill's house, we get to see the note Bill left behind. This tells us why we just spent the past 45 minutes watching Bill and Frank's story. Bill and Joel are essentially the same person. We see this when Joel and Tess eat with Bill and Frank in the flashback. Frank and Tess understand that a life can still be had. Frank and Tess talk like normal humans, but Bill and Joel just death stare each other the entire time. It's actually pretty funny. You can see that Bill and Joel are still closed off to the ideas posed by Frank and Tess. They're cold, they hate the world, they hate the people in it, but we get to see Bill's journey into realizing that letting someone in, finding someone to care for, is the best thing people like them can do. To save people, to find something to live for, to be vulnerable, and to let people in, to have relationships. Bill hated the world and everyone in it, but he admits that he was wrong. He found one person to care for that was worth saving. Now, the subtext behind these words in the letter originally was toward Tess, but obviously we know as the viewer Tess is dead, so the subtext behind the letter is obviously meant toward Ellie. That's why we saw Bill and Frank's story. It adds context to this moment. This chips away at the walls Joel put up since Sarah's death. This is the wake-up call that Joel needed. This is called character development. Pointless filler. by the way. Not to mention, Joel's progression as a character in this story is usually motivated through the actions of other characters, whether that be Tess, Bill, Henry and Sam, or even David. The characters we meet along the way in this journey aren't there for the sake of it. They're used to propel Joel and Ellie forward as characters. It's a trend this story follows in both the game and the show, and I'd argue the show actually used Bill better in terms of raw character growth and development for Joel than the game did. The episode also ends with Joel and Ellie securing the car to help them to get to KC, so although the show pivoted from a large portion of Bill's time in the game, the end goal was still the same. The plot still progressed. Therefore, by definition, it cannot be filler. It finalizes and progresses a key moment of the story of the game. And the only thing that we really lost from the game here in terms of what it pivoted towards is the Ellie and Bill interactions, because they never meet in the show. Everything else was either achieved from the game's point of view or was an addition that did help this story. We then see Joel and Ellie leave Bill's with Joel actually lightening up a little bit. You know, it's funny, it's almost as if the past 45 minutes of filler actually meant something. And then the episode ends with the shot in the open window, which is a reference to the game's main menu. Just cinema. Now look, I know I poked a lot of fun at some of the negative criticisms of this episode, but I'm just having a little bit of fun. I'm just an Australian dickhead stirring the pot a little bit. I have no problem with people validly criticizing something based on its artistic merit. No issue with that at all. But unfortunately, there was that subsection of people that didn't do that and, yeah, didn't even try to hide it. So if I piss those people off with this portion of the video, then, I don't know, sucks to suck. But now that I've had my fun, episode 4 does a really good job in keeping the momentum of the show going. We see more of Joel and Ellie continuing to bond. They bring the joke book into things here, which is a direct callback to the game, which I've always appreciated. The joke book doesn't serve as just this dumb device for a cheap laugh. It signifies Ellie's sense of humor and likability, but more importantly, it works as a barometer of sorts for how Joel is feeling toward Ellie. The more time they spend together, the more we start to see him go from being dumbfounded by the fact she finds the jokes funny to him actually laughing at the jokes, signifying the fact that he's letting his guard down and he's slowly building a bond with her. At the beginning of the episode, we see both Joel and Ellie trying to sleep and Ellie starts the conversation, but at the end of the episode, things flip around. Joel is the one to start the conversation with Ellie, and he even starts laughing at the jokes. This episode does a lot with Joel's newfound worldview given Bill's letter from episode 3, so we really start to see Joel's dynamic with Ellie change completely here. He teaches her how to hold a gun, he jokes with her, but he doesn't change his tune to the point of it being too quick. He can still be stern with her, and it's clear that there are still mental barriers that Joel needs to break down in order to accept Ellie. And I mean, he even refers to her as cargo in one scene. It's a gradual breakdown of Joel's mental barriers that he's put up since Sarah died, and the show does a good job in making sure it doesn't happen too fast. Now, this episode introduces a couple of new characters, one of which is Kathleen. Now, I still don't know how I feel about this character even after all this time. In isolation, I don't think this character was a home run, and she of course isn't in the game. She is a new addition to the show. But in context with Henry and Sam and their newfound dynamic in the show specifically, she's kind of a means to an end for their improvement over the game. Which, despite how annoying Kathleen could be, it's kind of a necessary evil to help Henry and Sam flourish as characters, which takes us onto episode 5. Episode 5 is a very strong episode. It's one of the best in the show, to be honest. I'd almost make a case for it actually being the best. The reason being isn't the big action sequence at the end, it's Henry and Sam. Now, I've made it clear how much I love the game, and I still do think the game is the superior version of this story by some distance. But Henry and Sam in this show are far better than Henry and Sam in the game, and that is a hill I am willing to die on even as a hardcore fan of the game. Henry and Sam have an almost entirely different dynamic in the show. Elephant in the room for the changes here, but Sam is a little bit younger and he's deaf in the show. Now, I know a bunch of knuckle-dragging morons just chalk this up to DEI, which just, Jesus man, go outside. The decision to have Sam be younger than he is in the game was a great idea in of itself, as it helps with the more paternal dynamic that Henry and Sam share. They are brothers, but Henry is the carer in every sense of the word. The fact Sam's also deaf naturally makes you sympathize with him as a character even more. So not only is he a young child, but he's also disabled. He's an innocent a character as you could possibly get in this world. In the game, Henry is kind of stern with Sam. He's pretty strict with him, and that works well for that version of the story, but this dynamic between these two characters in the show as brothers, with Sam being completely reliant on Henry, makes their end even more heartbreaking. The added depth to Henry and Sam is one of my favorite things about this show. Henry just wants to look after his little brother, that's it. But in order to help Sam, he needed to sacrifice a great man in order for that to happen, and that man was Kathleen's brother. So both Kathleen and Henry feel well within their rights to feel how they feel. I kind of see this parallel as a little taste of what's to come in season 2 of the show with Abby. It's kind of this matter of perspective. They're both well within their grounds to do what they're doing, but if you were in Kathleen's position and someone sacrificed your brother for their brother, you'd be pissed too. And if you were in Henry's position and you had to sacrifice someone to save your brother that's entirely reliant on you, then you'd probably do that too. So you really do understand where all characters are coming from. And it's also that moral dilemma that's foreshadowed with the ending of this story with Joel and Ellie. But obviously this show isn't about Henry and Sam, it's about Joel and Ellie. So how do Henry and Sam actually contribute to our main characters? Because that's what these side characters are there for in this journey. Well, they're essentially a mirror of Joel and Ellie in the near future. Joel sees himself and Ellie in Henry and Sam, and when Henry ultimately fails to keep Sam safe and he's bitten, Joel starts to realize that he may not be capable of being a good enough protector for Ellie, that he's going to fail just like Henry did. This is followed up on heavily in episode 6, and it's why Joel begs Tommy to take Ellie on the rest of the journey, because he thinks he's going to fail, and he simply can't do that again. He was tasked with keeping Sarah safe before the outbreak as her father, and he failed. He started to open up slowly to Ellie 20 years later, and as he's doing that, he sees Henry fail to protect Sam, which sends Joel down a spiral of panic and fear of failure. Like I said earlier, each character we meet along this journey directly aids in the development of Joel and Ellie. Time spent with side characters in this story is never wasted. Bill, Henry, Sam, Riley, David, all of them propel our characters forward. The ending of episode 5 is without a doubt the biggest gut punch of the show, and it was something I was dreading having to relive for the first time watching it. And rewatching the show again, it's crazy to me how effective it still is. And I attribute that to the character work done with Henry and Sam in this episode, and I absolutely love the actor that they got to play Henry here. Dude knocked it out of the park. Henry having to put Sam down and then turning the gun on himself is so well portrayed in this show. Now, something that I only picked up on because of a rewatch was this interesting detail. In the finale, Joel mentions that he almost shot himself not long after the outbreak, but he flinched and missed. He tried to end his life after losing Sarah, and he sees in this moment Henry do the same thing after losing Sam. This helps to hammer that point home of Joel's fear of failing Ellie. It opens up some emotional scars for Joel as well. We see him ponder over Henry and Sam's grave, and I think this is something that would have been running through Joel's mind at the time. Henry and Sam's death also does a lot for Ellie as a character. We see Ellie and Sam strike up a bond quickly. We're reminded of their childhood innocence, and when Sam is bitten, Ellie tries her best to save him using her blood. And when that doesn't work and Sam dies, this contributes to Ellie's guilt over her immunity. Why does Sam have to die when she doesn't? She had to watch Riley die, she had to watch Tess die, she had to watch Sam die. This is honestly the best episode of the season, and in my opinion, a perfect episode. Episode 6 is another strong episode with a fair few surprises along the way. We see that more time has passed, Joel and Ellie have a decent rapport, but you can tell that Joel is still living with what happened with Henry and Sam, and how he's scared to fail and keep Ellie safe. They decided in the show to add Joel having anxiety attacks to help convey how he's feeling in the moment and the inner struggles he's going through, and I think these weren't necessarily a needed addition to the show. Joel doesn't do this in the game, but they went with the sort of softer Joel in the show as opposed to Troy Baker's version. At this point in the story in the game, Joel is still hard as nails and very cagey. Here, he's a little more vulnerable, and I don't necessarily hate this idea, but it is a decision that I thought was a bold one to make. There's a really good scene with Joel and Ellie around a campfire where Ellie tries to get Joel to open up on what life entails for him after their mission is over. Joel mentions that he could see himself finding an old farmhouse on some land or a ranch with sheep, which, well, I won't spoil, but if you know, you know. It's nice to drop that little nugget here in the show. Now, instead of finding Tommy at the dam, we instead find Tommy in Jackson in the show. Bringing Jackson into the story early was, I think, a pretty good decision. It familiarizes us with the setting before season 2, where we spend even more time here. We get that really quick moment with Dina and Shimmer, which are nice nods to the second game, but this entire episode is essentially about Joel coming to terms with his emotions, to understanding how and why he feels the way he does. When Joel and Tommy reunite and Tommy mentions that him and Maria are together, Joel has a real hard time accepting it. This isn't because Joel's an arsehole necessarily, it's because Joel is stuck in his ways after losing Sarah. And the idea that life got to go on for someone else bothers him. That someone else being his own brother. Over the past 20 years, Joel has cut himself off from relationships entirely. Even Tess, who was closer with him than anyone, was still kept at an arm's length emotionally, and Tess accepted that. At this point in the story, Joel can feel himself getting closer to Ellie, and his natural instinct after 20 years is to put that wall back up. So when he sees his own brother happy and thriving with Maria, he simply refuses to even accept it. But when Tommy mentions that he's going to be a father, that's the point where Joel's bitterness really shines through. He's not even able to say congratulations. Tommy sums up Joel's frustrations perfectly with just one line, saying that just because life stopped for you doesn't mean it has to stop for me. And Tommy is 100% right. But at the same time, he knows it's complicated for Joel to hear it. The scene where Joel completely crumbles in front of Tommy is also a massive pivot from the game. Joel and Tommy in the game are just about to beat the shit out of each other at this point in the story. But here, they lean into Pedro Pascal's Joel being a little more vulnerable. We see everything Joel's carrying with him just come pouring out. After Henry and Sam, he's had to hold it together in front of Ellie, but when she's not around and with the only person left that he actually trusts, he lets it all out so Tommy can take her to the Fireflies. Despite being such a massive pivot from the game, this is one of the best scenes in the show, and any doubt that I had over Pedro Pascal in this role was pretty much thrown away after this scene. And I also need to give praise to Gabriel Luna as Tommy. He doesn't really look like Tommy, but to me, he sounds like him and works so well on screen with Pedro Pascal, and I can't wait to see more of him in season 2. But then the scene that I was honestly the most nervous for comes up in the show. The scene where Ellie confronts Joel over everything. She feels he's pushing her away and palming her off to Tommy, but she also found out through Maria about Sarah, which puts into context for Ellie why Joel treats her the way he does. Now, for context, this scene is my favorite moment from the game, and I don't think the show quite matched it, but it was still pretty strong as it does go almost beat for beat with the game's depiction. But to be honest, I just think Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson's performance in the game was better than Pedro Pascal's and Bella Ramsey's with the same material. This scene does so much for both of these characters, as it's the conversation that's needed to happen from the start. Joel keeps everything bottled up, and even Tommy doesn't bring up Sarah's name when they're arguing, but Ellie brings it up directly. This would be the first time in years that Joel has even heard Sarah's name said by someone else. This forced him to immediately snap back to the cold and closed off Joel we met in episode 1. He may not have liked it in the moment, but this is exactly what Joel needed to hear from Ellie. He's needed someone to tell him like it is for years. And Tommy and Ellie both do it in this episode. And it's why Joel eventually comes around and decides to continue taking Ellie to the Fireflies. Although Joel reverts back to episode 1 Joel in this scene after Sarah is mentioned, all the character development we've seen up until this point leads him to actually understanding that Ellie is right. So he puckers up and saddles her horse as they head to the Fireflies. Now, this scene from Ellie's perspective is just as poignant as it is for Joel. Ellie's biggest fear in this world is being alone. She talks about this with Sam earlier in the show. She's had a lifetime of losing people. She never knew her mother. She grew up in a Fedra camp. She lost her best friend Riley. She lost Sam. And the second Joel starts to get close, he throws her away. The interesting part about Joel and Ellie is they both fear the exact same thing. They both fear loss. but that's the reason why the two are incompatible for most of the story. Joel's fear of loss makes him unable to connect and hold relationships with anyone. Ellie's fear of loss makes her eager to keep people close. They have the exact same fear, and in reality, it makes them a perfect match, but it works in the opposite way because of Joel's trauma. So this scene was the only way for these two characters to come together, for that emotional barrier in Joel's mind to be knocked down, and it does. So they continue on their journey together, and we see them talking like they've never talked before. It's no longer a journey of Ellie and the reluctant companion. It's a journey of two people who are one. And after they reach the university and they find out the Fireflies are no longer there, Joel is injured and Ellie is then forced to survive without him, which takes us to the next episode. Episode 7 is probably the weakest episode of the show. It's by no means a bad episode or anything, but it is an episode dedicated directly to the Left Behind DLC, which tells you more about Ellie's life before the events of the beginning of the game. It shows us Riley, and it shows you how Ellie was bitten, and it adds more context to the guilt she feels for her immunity. Now, I know a lot of people refer to this episode as filler, just like people do with episode 3, and I mean, I think I made my thoughts pretty damn clear on that topic earlier in the video. By very definition, episode 7 is just not filler. It's the best case you'll find out of any of the episodes for being so, but that still doesn't make it filler. This episode helps to provide further context on why Ellie is the way she is. This episode makes Ellie a deeper and richer character. We can be told things about people's past, we can have it alluded to in visual storytelling, but nothing will ever match being able to actually see it happen. That's why this episode exists. We can be told Ellie was bit, and it's like, okay, but how? Why is Ellie's #1 fear being alone? Alright, let's see why. What was Ellie's life like before Joel? Well, here you go. This episode is Ellie's version of Joel's origin story. What we got in the first episode pre and during the outbreak for Joel, this is Ellie's version. The events that shape the characters as we come to know them when we see them for the first time in the apocalypse. A large part of this show with Ellie specifically is about having that childlike innocence taken away from her, which comes to a head with David in episode 8. But episode 7 gets to really showcase to us that childlike innocence, especially for a kid who's grown up during the apocalypse. How she's wowed by an escalator or riding a carousel. We see this to hammer that point home of Ellie's childlike innocence being taken away because of what David tries to do to her in the next episode. The Ellie that we see in this episode and the beginning of episode 8 is the Ellie that we literally never see again in this story. Whilst I think this is the weakest episode of the show, it's still as good as it possibly could have been given what it's drawing from. But I think more importantly, what this episode does is it sets up one of, if not the best episodes of the show. The winter chapter of the game in episode 8 is just another excellent episode and easily one of the season's best. I did say the first time I watched the show that it was actually my favorite episode. I think I'd give that to episode 5 upon rewatch, but make no mistake, this episode is fantastic. Now, they kept this section of the story pretty damn close to the game, but there were a couple notable changes. First of them being, they chose to show us David before Ellie comes across him whilst hunting. When playing the game, the intrigue around David is that question of whether or not you can trust him. You even have to fight a horde alongside him, but in the show they choose to let you know with the very opening scene that this guy is an absolute lunatic. He's essentially an abusive religious psychopath, and as the episode progresses, you come to realize he's also a cannibal and he's a, well, that. I can't say it, YouTube will get mad. He is the most vile and evil character in the show, and he is the character that completely destroys Ellie's childhood innocence. After David, Ellie is simply a different character. This continues the trend of the characters we meet along this journey having a massive impact on Joel and Ellie as characters. Now, a big complaint about the second half of this season is the lack of infected. As I mentioned before, there was a massive infected action sequence that the show did cut out of this episode. As I said, Ellie and David were supposed to team up to take on a horde, and I guess they chose not to for budget reasons. Now, this action sequence wasn't necessarily vital, but given how many people complain about the fact there is a huge lack of infected in the tail end of the season, I feel it is worth highlighting this. But what I think a lot of people need to understand is The Last of Us is not a zombie show. This is not a zombie story. It never was, and I know a lot of people walked into this show thinking that it was. This is a human story that takes place in a world where zombies exist. The Last of Us is simply just not another zombie story, and a lot of people criticize this show because of that factor. If you want that, there's droves of other media that you can run to. The Last of Us simply isn't that. It never was. Yes, there were infected sequences cut out of the later episodes, but if you're only watching for the infected, then you're kind of just missing the point of this entire story. If you take gameplay out of The Last of Us games, you will rarely come across any infected at all. If you watch the cutscene stories for the games, you will barely see any infected. That's because the meat and potatoes of this story has nothing to do with them. It's a human story first and foremost, and I think a lot of people need to remember that. At the end of the day, though, this episode is all about Ellie, and it's also about bringing Joel's arc full circle finally. Ellie has a confrontation with David and James. James is played by Troy Baker, which is an awesome cameo. For those who don't know, this is of course who played Joel in the games, so it's nice to see him here. Because despite how much I like Pedro Pascal as Joel, even though, again, he's kind of become a punching bag because he's just cast in everything these days, so a lot of people are saying he shouldn't have been Joel, but, you know, anyway, that's not important. What Troy Baker did with this character in the games, to me, simply will just never be matched, no matter how good Pedro Pascal is. Anyway, David and James are a part of a group that are struggling and have turned to cannibalism to stay alive, which we find out in really disgusting ways. The dialogue scene between David and Ellie is almost beat for beat with the game. David explains more about who he is, and the craziest thing is, he is holding back so many secrets, yet he never really lies to Ellie at all. He tells her the truth the entire time. It just goes to show how good he is at manipulating people by using the truth. His intentions aren't actually made clear until the end of the interaction. David is looking for the man who killed one of his group's members at the university a few weeks back, and that person was Joel. And instead of capturing Ellie, he uses her to track his way to Joel, and so Ellie can then be captured after Joel is killed. Because then David has plans for her. And it's here where we start to realize just how insane this guy is. The scene where Ellie tries to escape and David tries to, well, yeah. Ellie manages to get the upper hand on him and brutally beats him to death. Now, this isn't Ellie just killing David. In a way, this is Ellie killing any of the childhood innocence she had left. It's also Ellie proving that she doesn't need Joel to save her. When she was alone, she actually managed to survive. We all know being alone is her biggest fear. So through David, she actually conquered it, but at the sacrifice of her innocence. As for Joel, I love the scene where he kills the two group members despite getting the information he needs to find Ellie and track down David's group. It not only foreshadows what he's going to do in the story's climax, but it tells you how far he's come. He was reluctant to even take Ellie on this journey even after Tessa's dying wish. Yet now he's murdering droves of people whilst injured just to reach her. And when he does, he finds her at her lowest and offers her comfort and saves her on an emotional level. And this is essentially the completion of Joel's arc. It doesn't come in the finale, it comes in this moment right here. The second he calls her baby girl, which is what he called Sarah, the arc is complete. And take note of the position of the watch in this scene. This watch is the object tied directly to Sarah. It is front and center as Joel's arc completes. This isn't a coincidence. And this overall is just a fantastic episode. The finale of this season was simply rushed, if I'm honest. Now, what we did get here was great, and I was by no means disappointed, but the finale came in as the shortest episode of the show, and I think this is an issue. When you watch the finale, it's essentially you arrive in Salt Lake City, you're captured by the Fireflies, Joel's rampage, you save Ellie, and then you head back to Jackson and you're done. All of that happens in about 30 minutes. I never really felt like this episode actually took its time to breathe, which is something you can do in the game for as long as you want. After you make the decision to go to the point of no return before you're captured by the Fireflies, you can simply look out into the distance with Ellie with nothing but music playing in the background to take a breath, to take a moment to reflect on the journey. When I play the game, I sit on this point for ages every single time. It feels like the breath of the final leg of the game does need. But this episode never really took a breath at all. I'm not saying we needed a scene where Joel and Ellie just stand there for 10 minutes, but this episode needed to be at least 15 minutes longer. Maybe with some extra scenes of Joel and Ellie walking into the city, more time with Marlene and Joel, or more time with Joel and Ellie after they escape. Like, we don't actually see Joel and Ellie until the 10-minute mark of what is a 43-minute episode, and it's the finale. So we only get 30 minutes with our two main characters in the finale episode, which is just a strange decision. Again, what we do get is great, but it just feels like there's 10 to 15 minutes missing out of this finale. But with that complaint out of the way, what we get here is still incredible and respectfully adapted from the game. Now, the first 10 minutes of the episode are dedicated to Ellie's mother and Marlene. It's really great to see that they got Ellie's actress from the games, Ashley Johnson, to play Ellie's mum. It's like Ellie playing Ellie's mum giving birth to Ellie. It's like a whole Ellieception, but it's a nice touch. Now, I have seen some people say we didn't need to see why and how Ellie became immune, which this scene does show us. She was born when her mother was bitten, but the umbilical cord wasn't severed straight away, and Ellie's mother lies to Marlene about it. Now, I do understand the complaints here. Her immunity isn't really explained until Marlene mentions it at the end of the game, but we actually got to see why and how she becomes immune instead of her just being a genetic anomaly. And I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. I think it's kind of take it or leave it and not really a big deal. But I think this whole sequence here, at worst, it's just us getting to see Ashley Johnson play Ellie's mum. I think that's worth it in of itself. But when we finally pick up with Joel and Ellie in the finale, you can see that Ellie is clearly a different person after David. The roles have essentially reversed here. Joel is the one always talking. Ellie is the one staying silent. Joel found his humanity on this journey, and Ellie kind of lost hers. It's interesting how they've switched place. Joel at this point is comfortable talking about anything with Ellie, even about Sarah. We have a great scene where Joel talks about how he tried to shoot himself shortly after the outbreak, which is something I always thought about with Joel from the game. Like, if he was so miserable after Sarah's death, surely he might have tried something. And the show addresses that head on and tells us that he did, which is a detail that I actually really appreciate. And Joel makes it clear to Ellie that she was the one that essentially fixed him. It wasn't time that healed his wounds, it was Ellie, and I love that. But then things go pear-shaped. Ellie and Joel are captured by the Fireflies as they didn't know who they were, and it's here we get the revelation that Ellie has already been prepped for surgery, and the surgery is going to kill her. In order to extract a cure from her means they need to operate on her brain, which obviously means she's going to die. Meaning that Joel is about to lose his new surrogate daughter. He's gone on this journey of rediscovering his humanity, breaking all those mental barriers down to just have it ripped away from him all over again. This is where the moral dilemma comes into play, sacrificing Ellie for the potential cure to save the world, or letting his fear of loss take over and saving Ellie so he doesn't have to endure what he went through with Sarah all over again. This ending has been debated for well over a decade now, and we all know what the right answer is from a moral standpoint, but we all know it's irrelevant. We're human. The connections we make will always take over what we think is right in this situation. Now, something that I want to bring up that honestly I just do not see enough people talking about is around the ending of this show specifically and whether Joel was right or wrong. The debate around the ending does change in the show compared to the game because of one addition this show made all the way back in the very first scene of the show. The cold opening in episode 1 is evidence that Joel was right to do what he did from an objective standpoint, not a subjective standpoint, an objective standpoint. The game leaves more moral gray area for more discussion, but the show basically straight up says indirectly that what Joel does in the finale was the correct decision.
And there are no treatments for this, no preventatives, no cures. They don't exist. It's not even possible to make them.
That is exactly why what Joel did in the show was right. The idea around this ending, even in the game, was based off a chance of a cure, but the show definitely tells us from an expert in the field pre-outbreak that there is no cure and it's impossible to even make one. And the second cold opening in episode 2 does it again. Joel saving Ellie is objectively what should have been done in the show, because she would have just died for nothing anyway. Now, does this excuse the brutality of Joel's rampage from a moral standpoint? Probably not, but then we wouldn't have season 2. So whilst I think the ending still has a little more room for debate in the game, I think the show, it's pretty definitive what the right answer is. So Joel's rampage ensues and he murders everyone in sight in order to save Ellie. Now, I have seen some people complain about Joel's rampage too, saying that he doesn't even take cover. It was too easy for him to mow everyone down, and I understand this criticism and it's definitely valid, but I think that's kind of missing the point of what they're trying to convey here. This is a man completely taken over. Joel is essentially the Terminator at this point. They muffled out the audio to help convey Joel's tunnel vision on the goal of saving Ellie. His morals are out the window. He is an unstoppable force and nothing on earth will get in the way of making sure that Ellie doesn't die on that operating table. His fear of loss has grown that strong he's become inhuman at this moment. He's completely tunnel visioned. He's blind to any empathy for anyone else but Ellie. And I gotta say, I love how they conveyed this. Can you argue he should have taken cover? Absolutely. But that's not really the point in what they're trying to do here. When he reaches the operating room, he kills the surgeon and spares the nurses, of which one of those nurses is played by Abby's actress Laura Bailey from The Last of Us Part 2, which is a nice cameo. Same goes for Tommy's actor earlier in the show that I forgot to bring up. I love that they cameoed in so many of the actors from the games that didn't get to reprise their roles. But regardless, Joel saves her and the shot of the surgeon lingers. Those who know. But as Joel leaves the hospital and runs into Marlene, you can already tell that the implications of what he's done have already crossed his mind. Marlene mentions what Ellie would want and makes it clear to Joel that even he knows the answer to that question. But Joel in this moment is simply putting himself in front of Ellie. Joel's fear of loss is that strong that he'd be willing to rob Ellie of what she'd really want in this situation. Now, you could argue that a 14-year-old isn't mature enough to make that decision for themselves, sure, but Joel saving Ellie is a selfish decision. But we understand it and we don't blame him for it because of the journey we've gone through. So he kills Marlene so she can't come after her and lies to Ellie in the car on the way back to Jackson. Now, the final scene is one of just the best video game endings ever. It's so bittersweet, and I think it was portrayed pretty well here. Ellie pulls Joel up on what happened at the hospital, as she is clearly suspicious of what happened, and she knows deep down Joel's lying to her. She brings up Riley, Tess, and Sam as people that were bitten while she still gets to survive. She still carries her survivor's guilt, and it eats away at her, and this carries into the sequel pretty heavily. Joel has basically just taken something away from Ellie here, taking her sacrifice away from her. But of course, that gets picked up on a little bit later. Ellie in this moment just makes Joel swear that he told the truth. Joel swears, and Ellie says, okay. This is just the perfect bittersweet ending to this story, and honestly, it could have all just ended here and I'd be perfectly content. But there is a second game, and we have season 2 on the way, and everything I've seen for it so far looks really, really good, except for Bella Ramsey as older Ellie. And I'll get more into that when the show comes out, but I think they've made a mistake not recasting the older version of the character. But I will say, Abby looks great, and I am still looking forward to season 2. And when it comes out, there'll be a video here on the channel. So that is HBO's The Last of Us 2 years later. It hasn't aged as well for me as I was hoping, but I still think it's the best video game adaptation we've ever gotten. But when this show came out, I thought it was almost on par with the game, but I'd say it's not quite that close in reality. The game is still the far better version of the story despite the excellent additions this show makes. This is just a compelling season of television, and I hate how the internet has turned on it so much in the past year or so. All I can say is, this was a great season of TV, and it's time to buckle up for season 2.